It seems like a Cold War movie, a scary tale from a bygone age. An erratic Russian leader was assembling tanks and troops on the border with a neighbor. There was the dread of a deadly East West conflict. The Cold War then burst into a full fledged conflict when Vladimir Putin ordered Russian soldiers to invade Ukraine. The consequences were severe and far reaching. Even when Russian forces hit an approximate strength of 190,000 and the US warned in more alarming tones that a military attack was inevitable, Mr. Putin claimed that he was open to talks. European officials worked desperately to urge the Kremlin to back down. Now, Russia has formed up tens of thousands of troops at the Ukrainian border in a hostile act that might escalate into Europe's deadliest military conflict in history. The war is about Ukraine's destiny. However, Ukraine provides a broader stage for Russia to reclaim its dominance in Europe and the world, as well as for Putin to cement his legacy. These are not irrelevant goals for Putin, and he may determine that the only way to achieve them is to launch another invasion into Ukraine, an act that, at its most aggressive, could result in tens of thousands of civilian casualties, a European refugee crisis, and a response from Western allies that includes tough restrictions that will affect the global economy. Hey, welcome back to Economic Insiders. Give this video a big thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. It's free. Now, let's move on. What's behind the Ukraine crisis? After the fall of the Soviet Union, NATO pushed eastward, eventually encompassing the majority of the European states that had been under communist control. NATO members include the Baltic republics of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, who were formerly part of the Soviet Union, as well as Poland, Romania, and others. As a consequence, NATO expanded hundreds of miles closer to Moscow, confronting Russia directly, and in 2008, it announced that it plans to recruit Ukraine soon, but this is still regarded as a long-term possibility. Mr. Putin has portrayed the fall of the Soviet Union as a tragedy that deprived Russia of its rightful position among the world's great powers and left it at the whim of a parasitic West. During his 22 years in leadership, he has spent the majority of his time rebuilding Russia's military and reinforcing its geopolitical influence. The Russian president sees NATO's growth as dangerous, and the potential of Ukraine joining the alliance as a great threat to his nation. Russia's objections about NATO have been increasingly harsh as it has become more aggressive and militarily powerful. He has frequently raised the idea of American ballistic missiles and combat soldiers in Ukraine, even though authorities from the United States, Ukraine, and NATO all claim there are none. Mr. Putin has also claimed that Ukraine and Belarus are culturally and historically core parts of Russia. He has enormous power in Belarus, and talks regarding reuniting with Russia have been active for years. However, East-West ties worsened sharply in early 2014 when major protests in Ukraine overthrew a president loyal to Mr. Putin. Russia quickly attacked and occupied Crimea, which was part of Ukraine. Moscow also backed a separatist revolt that gained control of a portion of Ukraine's Donbass area, sparking a war that has killed over 13,000 people. What Putin wants now. Mr. Putin looks determined to turn back the clock for more than 30 years, creating an enormous Russian-dominated security zone equivalent to the clout Moscow commanded during the Soviet era. Now, 69 years old and potentially nearing the end of his political career, he wants to reintegrate Ukraine, a country of 44 million people, into Russia's sphere of influence. Russia issued NATO and the US with a series of written demands in December, claiming that they were required to maintain its security. The most important of them are guarantees that Ukraine will never join NATO, that NATO will cut its forces in the Eastern European nations that have already joined, and that the 2015 ceasefire in Ukraine will be followed, though Moscow and Kyiv disagree fiercely on what that would imply. Mr. Putin's timing may also be correlated to the changeover from President Donald J. Trump, who was especially amicable to him while trashing NATO, to President Joe Biden, who is committed to the alliance but disrupting the Kremlin. How is the United States responding? President Biden announced in early December that his administration was not thinking about sending soldiers to fight for Ukraine because, among other things, Ukraine is not a member of the NATO alliance and therefore does not fall under its commitment to mutual security. Instead, the US has supplied anti-tank and anti-aircraft weaponry to Ukraine, boosted American military presence in NATO nations bordering Russia, and deployed 7,000 extra soldiers to Europe. To reassure NATO partners in Eastern Europe, the Pentagon has approved the deployment of an armored brigade combat team to Germany. Administration sources also warn that the US may lend its support to a Ukrainian rebellion. The true hindrance, meanwhile, is funding. Western countries have pledged to freeze Mr. Putin's assets, and very little is known about what he possesses and where it may be kept. The Biden administration might also levy fines that would rob Russians of their cherished next generation smartphones, laptop computers, and other electronic devices.